Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Great talking. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Strictly Facts, the guide to Caribbean history and culture. In today's episode, we're following up on a very necessary history that we briefly touched upon in our conversation on Belize. Oftentimes, in discussions of race and ethnicity in the Caribbean in general, we tend to focus on Black populations, oftentimes the descendants of enslaved Africans, and additionally, Asian populations, usually from India or China, descendants of indentured servants. But less often do we really consider Indigenous communities like the Taino or the Arawak, especially in the present moment, and the fact that, contrary to popular belief, Indigenous communities still exist in the Caribbean today. Joining us today to chat about Indigenous Caribbean communities and the long overshadowed history of one particular community, the Garifuna, is Dr. Pablo Jose López Oro. Dr. Oro, thank you so much for joining Strictly Facts today. Why don't you begin by telling us a bit about yourself and how you became passionate about studying Indigenous Caribbean communities like the Garifuna?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm incredibly honored and humbled to be in your amazing company. All the love for your podcast. I'm incredibly grateful to be part of this conversation. Where did it all kind of start? So, Garifuna folks are a Black Indigenous community from St. Vincent whose history of marronage, cimarronaje, in St. Vincent and their eventual exile from British colonial powers in 1797 land them in Central America's Caribbean coast, particularly the Bay Islands of Honduras. And then there's mainland migration to Belize, Guatemala, mainland Honduras, and Nicaragua. I am a third generation Brooklynite of Garifuna Honduran descent. I'm really particular about the third generation Brooklynite, particularly because my paternal line, which is from Dangriga, Belize, migrates to New York City, specifically Harlem, in 1962, which really details a larger hemispheric movement of Black Indigenous communities. Specifically, Garifuna folks have been in the US and particularly the US South due to their labor with the United Fruit Company, have been in the US since the 1950s. And this is a community that remains slightly understudied, but also simultaneously really studied. So there's this interesting kind of scholarly conundrum around Garifuna folks, particularly because Garifuna folks as Black Indigenous peoples kind of really create this scholarly puzzle for particularly for anthropologists, right? So there's a ton of ethnographic research on Garifuna folks in Central America. There isn't enough scholarship on Garifuna folks in the US. So this is where my work is making an intervention and contribution to the body of scholarship on Black diaspora studies and hopefully on Black Indigenous studies, right? To kind of think about what does it mean to start considering peoples of African descent in the Americas, particularly survivors of the Middle Passage and their descendants, as Indigenous to the Americas. And Garifuna folks really model to us the possibilities of Indigenous Blackness in really generative ways.
It's so funny that you said that because you jump right in almost to my first question. One that we touched a bit upon in my discussion on the Maroons in Jamaica as well. The Garifuna in our particular discussion today are descendants of, as you mentioned, indigenous communities, whether that be the Arawak or the Kalingo, as well as enslaved Africans. So could you walk us a bit through what is known about this early history and the connection between Black and Indigenous groups, in that sort of 17th, 18th century period?
Absolutely. So in terms of the Garifuna context, right, a lot of the collective memory, right? So I turn to, to kind of think about even Hartman's work around the archive, right? There is a void in the archive, right? And Mark Anderson at the University of California, Santa Cruz really does this really phenomenal work of kind of teasing out British archives to kind of get a sense of, well, Garifuna folks were called Black Caribs. There was a moments of yellow Caribs, red Caribs in St. Vincent. But the collective memory that Garifuna folks have throughout the diaspora is that we are descendants of shipwrecked slaves, right? that a lot of our collective nostalgia around ancestry in St. Vincent is about a certain kind of fugitive freedom, right? It's about a cimarronaje, marronage that is really built on being shipwrecked slaves, but also Arawak Carib peoples, right? And this hybridity really informs our political subjectivity. It really informs the way Garifuna folks negotiate 21st century politics in Central America around land rights, land titles, particularly when Garifuna activists refer to Central America's Caribbean coast as terrenos ancestrales, right? Ancestral territories. And what does it mean for Black Indigenous people to make land, to create land, and to construct land as ancestral? Which is actually quite not unique to Garifuna folks, right? Black Colombians, I'm thinking particularly around the labor and political activism of Francia Marquez, where she talks about her community in Colombia from the 15th, 16th century as being built by enslaved Africans, right? That this is her ancestral land, right? That even though Africa is this homeland, that Colombia, right? La Toma Colombia is her ancestral land. And in fact, Black folks throughout Latin America and the Caribbean have used land in really important ways to negotiate their not only their Blackness but their rights in that space, especially within nations that deny their existence and particularly erase their existence to the building of the nation state. One thing about Garifuna folks in particular about this collective memory about being shipwrecked is that there's this turn to culture, right? So there's this, choreographed problematic negotiation when it comes to shipwreck slaveness, right? Because there's also a distancing to the histories of plantation life. There's also a distancing to slavery that I'm not really particularly convinced yet that that distancing does much, if any, if that makes sense, right? Like I think that distancing is done to also say, well, this is why our culture has stayed intact. And I'm not really certain that that is actually the cause, right? And I think there's something particularly interesting about the collective history around Maroonage, self-governance, particularly on the island of St. Vincent, that allows for this political imaginary to become really expansive, right? Whether it's archivally fact-checked or not. And in fact, my work is really much more interested in political imaginations, right? So thinking about this idea of Garifuna Settlement Day in Central America, right? So I'm not interested in whether the archive can prove what actually happened when Garifuna folks were exiled to Central America's Caribbean coast. What I'm actually really interested in is how Garifuna folks right now use that collective memory, that social memory of the arrival to Central America as a position of freedom, right? As a position of fugitive geographies, of maroon geographies, right? And I think in particular, what's really interesting in the case of Garifuna folks is that in all of the nation states that Garifuna folks reside and live and thrive in, their racialization and interpolation as Black people really questions their indigeneity, because we're still in this 21st century moment where we compartmentalize Indigenous people and Black people as separate, right? As in mutually exclusive from each other. And we don't really reckon with the histories that are quite literally at the intersections of each other, right? Garifuna folks really model to us what does it mean to actually think and engage on the political histories of living and breathing Black Indigenous folks, right? Who also are called to perform their indigeneity in really different ways, right? And who are called to really enact indigeneity because their Blackness, right, and their Black bodies are still described as non-Indigenous.
I want us to take a step back because I think a lot of what you got to, I want to still get to. But for those who may not be familiar with Garifuna's history, we've jumped from St. Vincent to Central America to New York to, the diaspora. But could you walk us a bit through concretely what happens, particularly in St. Vincent, that forces this exile abroad to the Central American coast and maybe what lends to, the first and second Carib Wars in the 18th century, et cetera.
Absolutely. So what's happening in St. Vincent is that here you have the emergence of Garifuna peoples and they're self-governed, right? They're constantly in battle with British and French colonial powers in St. Vincent, and they're very successful, right? And they're actually, in the colonial records, they're seen as these really hostile, warrior-like Africans, right? They're literally understood as these constant militant enslavement, resisting European colonial rule. And it actually creates this very important history around military. There is this Garifuna chief, which is adorned and loved and venerated, Joseph Satuye, who is understood to have fought against the British and won and was really successful. And there's a really fascinating story behind Satuye and his wife Baruda. Baruda was one of Satuyes' wives, and essentially one of the kind of political imaginaries around that story is that there's cross-dressing. One of the military strategies against the British and the French was to have the soldiers cross-dress. So the men were in women attire, and the military didn't expect. So it's this big moment where Baruda says, and I'm going to say it in Spanish because the way it's kind of collectively said and memorialized is that si vos no te pones los pantalones, yo me pongo los pantalones, right? So if you don't put your pants on, I'll put them on, right? And this is like kind of the oral history that has kind of transgenerationally passed on. And it's actually really telling about the gender politics, right? It's really telling, particularly because Garifuna folks are a matrilineal society, right? So women are not simply just kind of these placeholders on the economic labor division, like literally women are the ancestral connection, the landowners, right? They're the ones that have ancestral knowledge that is passed on to women. The matrilineal is beyond economics, right? It's beyond the labor division. It's quite literally in the very fabric of the entire culture. So because of that matrilineal practice and custom and tradition, this narrative actually is really informative, right? It really tells us that Garifuna women were at the forefront of the military prowess, right? At the forefront of military genius when it comes to how Garifuna folks were able to battle against the British and the French. So this moment, this kind of scene around the Carib Wars, if we were to like Garifunize it, is to really actually understand that Garifuna women gave that military intelligence to Garifuna men. And it's actually a really powerful oral history that remains, but still slightly untold because matrilineal society and culture doesn't necessarily mean that misogynoir doesn't exist, that patriarchy is very much still intact, even though there's a matrilineal culture and society. So I think it's important for me to like pinpoint that a little bit, but also what's happening here in the exile in St. Vincent is that Garifuna folks are exiled because they just don't succumb to European colonial forces. And the treaty, like the actual treaty between Garifuna folks and the British was like, you gotta go, right? You gotta go. The British had a lot of plans with St. Vincent. They had imagined St. Vincent to be another pearl of the West Indies, and they just had to literally take out the Black Caribs, right? And at that point, Garifuna folks are in the archive are being called Black Caribs. Once again, Mark Anderson writes this gorgeous piece for the Journal of Transforming Anthropology where he's like, there's these different racial categorizations that's happening in the archives. There's red Caribs, there's yellow Caribs, there's Black Caribs, and the Garifuna folks, Garinagu, are the Black Caribs, and they're the most resistant ones, right? So there's this collective memory is really telling to the ideas of like survival and resistance and perseverance, right, in the face of European colonization, which really kind of marks the diaspora, the Garifuna diaspora, right? Because one of the big moments in the arrival, it's arrival of exile, right? It's arrival of British colonial forces just taking Garifuna folks off of St. Vincent. And St. Vincent is quite literally the ancestral homeland of Garinagu. And Garinagu is the plural formation of Garifuna. So I'll go back and forth because it's like in my brain, it makes more sense to like, it's all of us. So Garinagu and Garifuna is kind of just like the descriptive adjective of the culture and music. But that exile is really important in Central America because in that exile, you know, Garifuna folks are arriving to a Central American Caribbean coast where there are already other Black folks, where there are Creole, Mesquite, Lenca, where there are other indigenous communities as well who are also resisting European colonialism, right? So this long history of Black and Indigenous resistance on Central America's Caribbean coast, Garifuna folks are walking into it in 1797. And it becomes a really important marker because that's happening before the Wars of Independence of 1821. And that's an important date because that means Garifuna folks and Creole folks and Mosquito folks and Lenca folks, they're fighting in these wars of independence, but they don't get to be narrated into that national historical project, right? They're certainly left out because of their Blackness and indigeneity. So when we look at Central America's kind of nationalist ideologies and political imaginaries, Black and Indigenous people are left out, even though they had been present and contributing centuries before the birth of the Republic. That's not uniquely like a Central America context, but I think Central America takes it to the next level. There's literally to borrow from Michelle Rolfe, right? There's a particular like intentional silencing of the past. And this is how anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity remained prevalent, right? Very pervasive in Central American nationalism is that they're literally written out. They don't exist, right? And the only time you kind of hear Garifuna folks is like the United Fruit Company. Well, Garifuna folks had been in Central America at least 200 years by the time United Fruit Company becomes a presence on Central America's Caribbean coast.
One of my reasons for starting Strictly Facts is the fact of like, why don't we know? And I mean, we as a collective, right? As Caribbean people, it shouldn't just be us in pockets knowing our own history. And so to sort of continue off this point that you're making of this shift to Central America or the forced exile to Central America, because it wasn't by choice. And I want to reiterate that point. The Garifuna, are forcibly exiled. A number of them go to Roatan, an island off Honduras, which in a very cruel history, like the island was uninhabitable for a large part, right? With the support of Spain, that helps them transition to sort of mainland as well, right? But then it becomes, as you're saying, a challenge between the indigenous populations that were already in Central America. So could you help us problematize that a bit more? What necessarily takes place as they are relocating and how that, maybe those problems are persisting to the present?
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you. You are making me dig into my historian cap. There's so much work on this. I also want to like just like verbally cite, the work of Edmund T. Gordon, Juliet Hooker, Charles Hale, Mark Anderson, Courtney Desiree Morris, and even like Garifuna scholars, right? Joseph Palacio, Miriam Miranda. Like there's this history and reckoning with deeply understanding that once Garifuna folks are exiled by the British in 1797 and they arrive to Roatan and they arrive to the other Bay Islands of Honduras and they kind of immerse themselves in these transgenerational migrations to Belize, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and mainland Honduras, it has everything to do with their negotiations with Spanish colonizers. And I think it's important to also reckon with the fact that Garinagu folks had multiple colonizers, were colonized by the British, were colonized by the French. And then their last colonizer were the Spanish, right? So this is why the majority of Garifuna folks who have not been intermarried into Creole homes, right, have a Spanish last name. So this is like Aurelio Martinez, right? Like the big kind of huge Garifuna musicians, yeah, they're going to have palacios, right? Even though they're in Belize, right? So there's this longer history about Spanish colonialism and the negotiations they did with Spanish colonizers. And one of the realities about that history is that the British were still there, that the British were also still in Central America's Caribbean coast. So this was a really strategic move by Garinagus to be able to negotiate with the Spanish because they had already been dealing with the British in St. Vincent. There was this allyship that really kind of benefited, obviously, a lot more of Spanish colonizers than they would Garifuna folks. But in fact, that history is really telling in the present because one of the ways in which Garifuna activists in Central America fight for ancestral land rights is reminding mestizos and reminding the descendants of Spanish colonizers, we did this treaty. This is our land, right? We did this pact with you. There was this contract. There was this treaty for land in exchange for military power, for military engagement. And I think it's important to not like void that history because I think that history gets silenced incredibly frequently in the context of Central American history. But it's a history that also really tells us about how Spanish colonialism's anti-Black impulse is strategic because here you have this Black indigenous community who got kicked out of St. Vincent because the British couldn't handle their military power. Literally, their resistance, their rebellion, right? Their marronage, right? And the Spanish used that marronage for their advantage, right? And in fact, it was Garifuna folks who really ended up, fighting against the British on Central America's Caribbean coast, specifically in Honduras, right? And this is why there was this kind of physical removal of British colonizers to the more British Honduras, which is present day Belize. And that history is incredibly important because it really shapes the political imaginaries of the geography and also the Caribbean coast of Central America. It really highlights the history of Black and Indigenous folks in that space that doesn't get centered in the dominant narrative. One of the persistent political imaginaries around being Garifuna in the hemisphere is that resistance, right? Is the knowing that we are warrior-like people, right? That we will fight against European colonialism, that we will fight for our lives, and we will fight for our culture and our land. Because one thing that is really persistent is that Garifuna culture has not stayed intact, because that's not how culture works, but there's parts of Garifuna culture that are fragmented from St. Vincent, that are fragmented from Central America, that are fragmented from the United States, right? And my work particularly looks at those fragmentations in New York City.
I do want to talk about, as you're talking about lived and sort of felt imaginaries, I do want to talk about the meaning of Settlement Day, right? Have to name activists like Thomas Vincent Ramos from Brazil, who was literally one of the, pioneering activists saying, like, we really need to adhere and celebrate this history. I know you did it a bit for us a little bit earlier, but could you talk about really what Settlement Day means for Garifuna populations?
Yes. And I'm so grateful that you brought that question up, particularly because it's the second chapter of my very much in progress book manuscript. Garifuna Settlement Day is incredibly important. And it's incredibly important for multiple reasons. And thank you for bringing Thomas Vincent Ramos into this space. A phenomenal Garifuna man, born in Honduras, raised in Belize. And I think it's important to highlight that, right? That it's important to highlight that in many ways, Garifuna communities, peoples, and cultures and histories are borderless, right? When we think about Central America's Caribbean coast. And I love the fact that he was born in Honduras, particularly in Puerto Cortes, which is actually very close to Belize and Guatemala. And his constant migration between those spaces is just so telling of how Black folks have always transcended borders, right? And I'm just like, this is a perfect example of how a Black Indigenous man and communities transcend borders, and these borders don't mean anything, right? Like in many ways. So the reason I spend time with Garifuna Settlement Day, because it becomes really fertile grounds to think about the public performances of our around Garifuna. And particularly, I'm interested in this idea of arrival and this idea of arriving as exile, particularly because it's grounded in this idea of resistance. It's grounded in this idea of being marooned. And being marooned means that there's a particular negotiation with the land, right? And land and ancestors, right? So these enactments that have been happening since the 80s, and Belize is actually the first kind of location where Garifuna Settlement Day happens in the Americas. And the second one is in Brooklyn, New York, which is why it is incredibly important in the book manuscript, because a lot of folks don't know that, right? That a lot of folks don't know that Garifuna Settlement Day emerges out of the political activism of a Garifuna Honduran in Belize who really wanted to have the Belizean nation state recognize the cultural contributions of Garifuna folks. And in many ways, kind of in a really simplistic terminology around political activism, Garifuna Settlement Day is about quite literally the politics of visibility, right? It's literally saying we have arrived, we've been present, we have been present, and we're reenacting what our ancestors did in 1797. And that reenactment has a huge spiritual, intellectual, and political commitment to Garifuna-ness, to the Garifuna diaspora, but also to claiming ancestral rights to land, claiming ancestral rights to nation states that were non-existent, right? That there is a history of Garifuna folks prior to the nation state And this Garifuna Settlement Day also allows for a conjuring of ancestral memory. This is where I'm like, Hartman really gave us what we needed to have in Venus in Two Acts, because it's like, what does it mean to literally take embodied archives of ancestral memory and perform it publicly, right? And perform it, one of the things about that performance is that it's also not just a Garifuna performance, right? That in many ways, the gaze is the nation state, right? That in the context of Central America, Garifuna Settlement Day has evolved into these huge multicultural celebrations where the nation state, the mestizo nation state, right, can come and say, yes, we have Black people and their culture is authentic and their culture is amazing. Come spend money here. These are the communities. And I think obviously the origins of that was to honor and to remember the ancestors, right? And to make space, right? And I think Garifuna folks, like all Black and Indigenous folks throughout the diaspora, have been really strategic about making space and creating space. And Garifuna Settlement Day is doing that, right? It's literally carving and conjuring an ancestral space for Garifuna folks from yesterday, from today, and for tomorrow, because particularly Garifuna folks' concerns around culture, right? This idea of losing culture, of losing the language, of losing the knowledge that the ancestors brought with them. So there's also this kind of contemporary push to bring younger generations of Garinagu into these performances so they can remember and honor their ancestors, right? And what I really love is like, folks are not fact checking anything, right? Like there is no archival evidence of this and that, like even the size of the ship, even the idea of like, what did the ancestors physically bring with them? But what I love about Garifuna Settlement Day is that there's a conjuring of political imaginaries that come into that space. The historical fact checking is so irrelevant, so entirely irrelevant, because the performance of arriving, the performance of surviving that arrival, right? The brutality of that exile, it wasn't just like that exile was really incredibly violent. It wasn't this kind of, yep, just get on and go. It was violent getting on and then getting off, right? And I think it's important that Garifuna Settlement Day continues to be the space where Garifuna folks in the context of Central America are able to negotiate with the nation state and also create a space for their visibility. Now, Garifuna Settlement Day in New York City, those are a different kind of politics, right? Particularly because there's just no physical ancestral land there to make, right? To kind of create. So a lot of the work that I do when I'm analyzing Garifuna Settlement Day in Grand Concourse in the Bronx, right? In the Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn, or in downtown, Manhattan or Brooklyn, is this idea of, well, what is it about Indigenous Blackness in the company of African Americans, West Indians, other Afro-Latinx communities that is disrupting Garifuna Settlement Day, right? There's something about Garifuna Settlement Day as a disruption to what we normatively understand to be Indigenous, to be Black, to be Central American, but it's also a borrowing a lot from other Black immigrant communities, right? So the West Indian Day Parade, that's entirely Black Caribbean immigrant labor that we have the Eastern Parkway every Labor Day because of Black Caribbean immigrants who wanted to make sure that their culture remained, right? That even though they're in the United States, even though they're in a different geography, that they wanted a space to really venerate and honor and celebrate their culture. So Garifuna folks are really building off of the activism of West Indians, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans in the New York City context. I'm also constantly thinking about, what is this multicultural melting pot moment in New York? Particularly because Garifuna Settlement Day emerges after David Dinkins. And David Dinkins is really critical to the visibility that Garifuna folks get through like bilingual education programs for Garifuna folks. I mean, remember, like, Garifuna folks are migrating from Central America's Caribbean coast and they're speaking Spanish, right? They're coming into Spanish-speaking communities in New York City and New Orleans and LA and Houston. So there was this moment in the 90s where there was this programming, right? There's a Garifuna Day in City Hall, right? There's this kind of literal formation of creating Garifuna cultural visibility. And I'm always wondering, what is both intellectually and politically at stake? And I have a couple of answers to that. Like, I have a couple of wonderings and thinkings.
We can save it for the book. You don't gotta.
Okay,
No,
okay.
I get it. I think what you said about Settlement Day, I do want to just reinforce because I think there are a lot of ways our histories are told and just like depreciated in value. The fact that Settlement Day is like, we're going to tell y'all what happened, right? We're going to show it. And, even the fact that when we do quote unquote have these archives, right, they don't point us in the best light oftentimes because they weren't written by us. So the fact that we have Settlement Day as this very present annual celebration, and are just basically like, you could say that the ship was this size, but it is what it is. And we're going to, relive what is most beautiful, what is most true for us, I think is really important.
Yes.
You're bringing up New York. So I obviously got to do a discussion of diaspora, right? I mean, I am a product of the diaspora, so I'm not shading diaspora or anything in the sense, but I do think, there are often problems like brain drain, like all of these issues that arise where movement is considered. And, as a Caribbean people, I think movement, migration is inherent to who we are, right? There are pockets of us everywhere around the world. I remember studying abroad in college and like finding a Jamaican in Greece, right? Like just because we move, how does that impact Garifuna populations today? You did touch on it a bit, in terms of like reinforcing histories, but what are sort of those problems, and the connections also, as you were talking about, with New York, but, even as Nicole Ramsey mentioned, there are big Belizean populations in California as well. And so how are these pockets coming together of people?
Woo, that is a dissertation question right there. A couple of things come to mind. There are already two monographs in the world on Garifuna folks in New York. Sarah England writes an ethnography, particularly on first generation Garifuna New Yorkers from the 90s, 80s, and 90s. So she really doesn't pay much attention to the communities from the 60s, 70s. I'm quite literally interested in generations that have already been in the US for 2 to 3 to 4. But she does a beautiful job on really articulating the transnational aspect of Garifuna New Yorkers' activism around notions of land, of notions of indigeneity. And then Paul Christopher Johnson writes this other manuscript on Garifuna religion. And his kind of huge debate is like essentially trying to figure out how African is Garifuna religion. And he obviously uncovers that, yes, Garifuna folks are very African and very indigenous. And I'm like, yes, sir. But I think one of the things that gets left out of both of those manuscripts and kind of the larger history of Garifuna folks in the US is that Garifuna folks are entering the US as imperial subjects. They're not leaving Central Americas because of a civil war or a revolution, right? They're leaving Central America because of anti-Blackness. And they're leaving Central America because a United Fruit Company gives them an economic opportunity to leave. And they're going to New Orleans, right? New Orleans is quite literally an extension of the Banana Republic in Central America. That's an important piece of history that gets left out a lot, particularly because New Orleans, as one of the meccas of the Black Atlantic world, I mean, Garifuna folks are entering the US South, right? So Glenn Chambers writes this amazing recent book on like essentially Black Central Americans in New Orleans and how they're negotiating their Central Americanness, their Latinidad, right? In that time period, their Hispanidad, and their Blackness in New Orleans. That part of history becomes really important because New York is actually a later part in the migration, right? That New York actually isn't as central to the story, right? It's not the beginning to the story of Garifuna folks in the US. And I really want to be able to center New Orleans in a way that's in conversation with New York, because in many ways, the financial offices and the financial structures of the United Fruit Company were in both places, right? They were in New Orleans and they were in New York. And the reason I start there is because it's important to think about, to borrow from the work of Lada Putnam, what does it mean to think of Garifuna folks in the company of other Black communities, right? So I'm interested in the ways in which, in the company of African Americans, in the company of the Schomburg Center, right? How does that really shift the diasporic contours of Black indigeneity And in particular, I bring Schomburg into the conversation, not only because of the naming of a Black Puerto Rican man, one of the most important archives of Black culture in the hemisphere, but it's also a space that allows for this in the company of to really highlight, right? So one tendency that happens in the body of literature on Black Latinx immigrants is that there's this tension with African immigrants, right? That there's this kind of cultural tension, right? This linguistic tension. And I think those tensions are like incredibly real. They exist, but they're not the hallmark of the relationship. That at some point, the fact that Garifuna folks, second and third generation, are going to HBCUs, that's not a tension. That's a falling into US Blackness as a form of diasporic solidarity. That in many ways, the ways in which Latinidad is so anti-Black in the US is that, of course, Garifuna folks are going to go to Medgar Evers College before they go to Boricua College. Absolutely, right? There's a space for Garifuna folks as both Caribbeans, as Central Americans, as part of the Black diaspora. These tensions exist, but they, at some point, Blackness transcends those tensions, right? And that these spaces become really important because one of the earlier activists within the Garifuna spaces in the Bronx and Brooklyn, they're West Indians, right? West Indians are modeling to Garifuna folks, what does it mean to literally talk about your Black ethnicity in a space, right? And they really mock that. And it's incredibly important because one of the things that I discovered in the Schomburg Center, so, I'm like, finished my qualifying exams, I'm, did my dissertation perspectives, and I'm like, okay, I'm going back home to New York and I'm gonna do this work. And I go to the Schomburg really happy. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna look for Garifuna stuff. And they're like, I found like maybe three things. Three things. And I actually had to comb through West Indian archives in the Schomburg to actually find Garifuna stuff. And I was like, this is so interesting. It's interesting because I'm not surprised that Garifuna archives are in West Indian archives, right? Because of the communities that were already in New York, right? But also the communities that were already in New York and the ways in which that they would also allow Garifuna folks a space, right? So of course I didn't find Garifuna stuff in el Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños, right? Even though Garifuna folks are part of, right? Ida Lambert, who's a Garifuna woman from Honduras, in the 60s, living in East Harlem, she's part of the founding committee on El Desfile de la Hispanidad. But I don't find Garifuna stuff in Dominican archives or Puerto Rican archives, right? So it's so fascinating to me to always find it in West Indian archives because it makes complete sense. And even though there's a language barrier, it ends up not being an actual barrier. And I think it's important to think about, I always love the idea of in the company of, because I want to really move away from this kind of pervasive idea of like, there's these tensions and yeah, God, we're human, right? So there are tensions, but there are tensions that are really rooted in these kind of white supremacist ideologies around ethnicity and all of these things. And I'm just like, yeah, the tension is irrelevant. Like, let's get to the work. And the work is Blackness, right? The work in the context of Garifuna folks is indigenous Blackness, right? And they're really articulating a certain kind of indigeneity that is of African descent.
So you've heard it here, folks. Definitions or, the distinctions between being Black and Indigenous, particularly in this Garifuna context, are null. Like, there are Caribbean Indigenous communities counter to the sort of, overwhelming narrative. They weren't all killed, from Columbus and that whole, 1492 story. They are present, they are living, they are, existing and breathing and changing the world still today. This was like probably one of my favorite episodes. So thank you so much. This was so great. I have to ask my favorite question though. Everybody knows it's my favorite question of all. I love music. I love culture. That's what I write. That's what I study. What are some of your favorite examples of Garifuna history or Garifuna culture through history? Where do we see some of the art just really highlighting Garifuna history beautifully? And it could be Settlement Day. That was probably me giving you one, but if you want to, you can use that one. I won't take it from you. But yes, I would love to be like, what is the one song or the novel or the film that I definitely have to check out?
So I love Aurelio Martinez. I deeply respect his activism through Garifuna music, through Garifuna dance. And there's this song called Africa that he writes at a time period where there's these two very different Garifuna organizations in Honduras. One is called OFRANE, which is one of the oldest one, Organización Fraternal Negra de Honduras. And then ODECO, Organización de Desarrollo Étnico. And both of them they're really both politically really different, particularly because one is much more interested in like Garifuna land freedom. And then the other one is more interested in kind of being integrated into Honduran nation state, right? So one is always constantly more interested in government and one is more actually interested in community-based activism. And there's not a hierarchy. I'm not putting the binary, the dichotomy, but he writes this song, Africa, right? It's a story, it's a song that really details the Garifuna diaspora from Africa to St. Vincent, from St. Vincent to Roatán, from Roatán to mainland Central America's Caribbean coast, and then from Central America's Caribbean coast to the United States. And it's a song that really captures the multiplicity, the resistance, the rebellion, the maroonage. But it's also a reminder about how Africa is at the core of this, right? That in many ways, Garifuna folks can talk about their indigeneity, they can talk about their culture, but we can't forget Africa, right? That Africa gave us all of this culture. And this is where the kind of negotiations around indigeneity and Blackness become really complicated, right? And they get complicated because hybridity is kind of the core of the narrative, but this song really reminds us that the motherland is Africa, right? That in many ways, Garifuna folks wouldn't be Garifuna folks without Africa. And it's a gorgeous song. And it's kind of like a little bit of a Garifuna ballad. The drumming is really low. And it's really soothing to hear his words and reclaiming of Africa as the motherland of Garifuna folks.
Oyago, stay tuned for Strictly Facts Sounds, where we connect our history to pop culture. For this Strictly Facts Sounds, what better way to pair the knowledge and resources Dr. López Oro shared with us than with two documentaries? Filmmaker Andrea Leland has developed two great documentaries on the Garifuna. The first, entitled The Garifuna Journey, historicizes the culture in Belize through food, dance, music, and spirituality. And her more recent film, Yoramin, which means homeland, was released in 2013. Much like our episode today, the companion film recounts the lesser-known history of the Indigenous community in St. Vincent and their story of resistance, repair, and memory. Check out both online from our Strictly Facts syllabus now. Thank you so much for joining me on Strictly Facts today. This was such a generative conversation. It was so great talking with you, Dr. López Oro. I hope the listeners enjoyed this. We'll have links to all of the readings and, activists, etc., that we mentioned in this episode on our Strictly Facts syllabus online. And we hope you enjoyed this episode, everyone. Little more.
Thank you. Appreciate y'all.
Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.